Welcome, everyone, to the Yours Truly podcast today. I'm excited to have Lance Cleaver returning to join me. As I've delved deeper into the realm of existential and spiritual meaning, particularly in the context of the online world, I've encountered a diverse array of religious perspectives. Notably, I've found a significant presence of individuals connected to Eastern Orthodoxy. Of the approximately 20 conversations I've had, about a quarter have been involved in active participants or recent converts to Orthodoxy within the last 5 years. Additionally, I've engaged with individuals representing various facets of Orthodox experience, from those deeply rooted in Orthodoxy to those exploring it, and even those transitioning away from it. Not unrelated, many of these conversations have intersected with the influence of figures like Jonathan Peugeot and the broader Orthodox community, such as Father DeYoung, Lord of the Spirits podcast, and even the recently deceased Michael Heiser. Reflecting on my experiences, it's clear that Orthodoxy is far from marginalized in online discourse. In fact, it seems to be gaining momentum. This was particularly evident at the recently 500 to 700 person attended Symbolic World Conference or Summit last February, where a significant portion of attendees were affiliated with Orthodoxy. Jonathan Peugeot, the founder himself, has notably incorporated Orthodox elements into his public persona and is an evangelical convert. Even Jordan Peterson donning Orthodox-inspired blazers during his recent appearances. Despite any skepticism or resistance, it's undeniable that Orthodoxy is making its mark in the digital sphere and in the real world. Even as we grapple with critiques or concerns about the appeal of traditional practices in a rapidly changing world, the growing presence of Orthodoxy online suggests that it is indeed resonating with many. This trend has not gone unnoticed by content creators like Paul Vanderklay, who have begun exploring the phenomenon on their channels. Paul's recent video, titled, "Is Orthodoxy Just Another Carrot in the American Protestant Stew?" sparked lively discussions, heavily contributed to by a certain Joseph, and myself, and Lance, further highlighting the relevance of Orthodoxy in contemporary discourse. Lance Cleaver recently hosted a live stream with Joseph, where they were discussed an evangelical church in Montana undergoing a transformation towards Orthodoxy, signaling a broader cultural shift. Eager to explore these dynamics further, I reached out for a conversation with Lance, driven by a curiosity for the unconventional and genuine interest in theological exploration. Our dialogue serves as both a journey of personal discovery and a contribution to the ongoing discourse surrounding Orthodoxy and its evolving role in contemporary society. So, without further ado, I give you Lance Cleaver. Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud. What's up, Lance?
How's it going,
You
Christian?
there? Good, man. Glad to have you back.
Yeah, I don't know. We're having internet problems at the office, so this may go off or it may not. I apologize in advance if it doesn't work.
It's all right. We can pause it and wait and try again if we need to. So
So
yeah, it
anyway,
happens.
well, hey, thanks for inviting me into this discourse, brother.
Yeah, man. Well, I mean, I was reading there. I bump into it a lot here, and I think it's it's undeniable. Peugeot's influence, even his influence on Jordan Peterson, wearing Orthodox clothing, and Lord of the Spirits guys, and even Michael Heiser. I don't know, like he was kind of pointing that he wasn't Orthodox, but people that even in my little town were influenced by him towards Orthodoxy. So it is fascinating, and I still think it's very much tip of the spear. And when you hear the numbers aren't big, but that's not how things start. It's like these small things, and this because I think part of the perspective that you bring to this conversation is having seen trends or waves within American Christianity. As you have a few more years on some of us, and you've watched them ebb and flow, and they've ebbed and flowed in your own life. So I was kind of wanting to ask you if you would kind of start at that point. You share that kind of briefly sometimes, but dig in a little bit to your involvement with seeker movement, relevance, then to house church, and then you find your way to Orthodoxy. Kind of like give us a little bit of the story for you.
Yeah, so I grew up Methodist, and I was baptized Methodist, but we kind of didn't go to church a lot till about I was 13. That coincided with my dad getting sober, and it was a perfect time to go back and become Methodist because that's the time of confirmation. So
Hmm.
I dove in. I just dove in. I loved it. I was the nerd who was reading his Bible up in his room and stuff, and just soaked it up and asked for more materials. And so spent a lot of time. If you're a good Methodist boy, you learn a lot about John Wesley. So, but that's kind of where it is. And Methodism at the time that I went to was very traditional, very liturgical. Like if I hear a traditional Methodist service today, I know right where I'm at. Like I know where the doxologies are, the benedictions, and we say, Lord have mercies. Like there's this stuff that I know the prayers, like I know the rhythm and the Methodist hymns. And so that's where I was at. But what happened to me in that instance was, and I also was right after college, I went to a Catholic college and didn't attend much church then, but right after I got married, right out of college, and went right back into the Methodist church, which is very weird. A lot of people of my age, Gen X, like they'd go back after they had kids. So they kind of, for the most part, like, so anyway, but then there was this shift that happened in the 90s, and this happened in the mainline where all of a sudden they were trying to bring in contemporary services. Because what happened, Jesus movement, Willow Creek, Seeker Relevance, all of a sudden pastors were saying, wait a minute, it seems like the only places that are growing and being attractive are those that are doing, that whole kind of worship music, right? Like it's contemporary worship music. And, then with respect to that, so you started to see, so I started to experience it. I didn't realize what I was in at the time, but I actually found it cool because like I love music. Like, you know what I mean? Like I go to a lot of live shows and stuff. And so that seemed to fit like, wow, this is kind of awesome. And then I ended up leaving the Methodist Church in the very early 2000s. You could start to see the split that ultimately happened in the UMC. And I was part of a mega, like 8,000 people a weekend. We grew, it just exploded the Methodist church I was at. And so that was interesting. But then there were some theological things that were coming in that I was starting to see the red flags that ultimately ended up being the divorce that happened. So anyhow, went to a Willow Creek non-denominational church, right? And and I would just say, like, I was really caught up in that. I was the guy that was going to the Sunday night worship, just the worship, and the Wednesday night worship, and then going to the Sunday and stuff, and really got into all that stuff. And so all the Christian artists too that you all know in the Passion conferences and everything, like, yeah, I mean that I was down with that or whatever. But something started to happen in the mid 2000s, and that church that I was going to was right in my neighborhood, and it was a small mega, but it was definitely Willow Creek model. Like we did a whole sermon series on YouTube songs, stuff like that. Like I mean, you get the vibe that like what was going on there. That founder, that pastor, ended up leading that church, and he started kind of speaking about, hey, the heroes, and this is America. And so he was a little bit ahead of the game. And
He started thinking about
what he found was being a mega church pastor is it wasn't producing disciples. Go ahead.
he started speaking about what?
Did I cut out?
Yeah. But what did he start
I'm sorry.
speaking about when he left?
He didn't see us producing disciples, particularly on the budget that you had to have for the large building and everything else. But he wasn't seeing it at the level they were doing it. They could fill the seats, but those seats were just kind of churning and burning, if that makes sense. Like you could still do a 1,500 or 2,000, but it wasn't producing that call and that deeper life. And so he came out and started, he was doing a seminary, an accredited seminary kind of within that church. And he ultimately did that, but we started doing the house church planning movement. So that was kind of the very first, and this would have been, 2008, 9, 10, where you're starting to see that, wait a minute, like the seeker relevance megachurch model there seems to be some cracks in that. And this is a real new phenomenon. Like, let's just understand, like, this is a really new phenomenon. And so I was a part of that, and we were trying to do, house churches and so on and so forth, and really trying to call people into the life, like to live the life, right? And that would include practices and disciples making disciples. You hear that in a lot of mission statements at a lot of churches: disciples making disciples, right? That was it. Like, call into the discipleship and to live in the life, and so on and so forth. So, I was running around, and like, there was this guy, Hugh Halter, who's a stud. He was out in Denver, and he was running these cohorts, and he around trying to teach people to be bivocational, because they saw the consumeristic kind of model. You started to see millennials were, even if you would talk to them then, were kind of rejecting that. This is like the precursor of what we've seen now through the deconstruction or whatever. They were like, they wanted something, and millennials would use the word authentic. Like, so if you actually go read the stuff that was happening, they wanted something more authentic. Like, they wanted the stained glass. What Paul would talk about, crunchy, like they wanted it being crunchy, because what they would tell you is like, I can go to a better coffee shop on Sunday morning than you have. I can go to a better concert on Saturday night than what you're putting on here. So I have been seeing that. In addition, I'm a church nerd. So one of the things I've been following, and particularly since the over 25 years in the year 2000s, which we varnish statistics and everything else, is I've been really curious about, well, how do you plant a church and how do you attract people here? And what are these things? What's going on? You could see the trend down that was happening in church attendance. You could see the main line doing these things. You could even see in evangelicalism, it wasn't a net ad. People were reshuffling the deck chairs, and more people would go to, if you had a really charismatic speaker and an awesome worship service, you'll grab Christians to come. But most of them aren't new converts. They're just people that left something else to aggregate here where there was those sorts of things there. So I've been deeply attuned to seeing this thing that's been happening in the church. And one of the things that's fascinating, and this will kind of stick the landing a little bit here, and I found my way into Orthodoxy. And 12-step recovery is part of my spiritual foundation too, which is very embodied, practice-oriented, those sorts of things. But one of the things a church planner would have never said in the 90s or the 2000s or the early 2010s is that, hey, I'm going to do something more traditional, something more liturgical, and people are going to show up. Like I'm just telling you, that did not exist in the ethos. In fact, you would say, if you do something more traditional, no one will show up. And yet, and what probably sparked our conversation here is I shared something on X. Father Stephen Damick, who's on the Lord of Spirits podcast, he went out and started checking with his fellow Antiochian clergy and trying to figure out, there seems to be this surge into Orthodoxy. And for a surge for Orthodox it's not a million people are showing up. It's like, okay, we had over 30 years, we had 20 new chrismations and baptisms, right? And all of a sudden, over the past couple of years, that same church is now seeing 50, 100. Like, it's blowing their minds. And I, for the past 4 years, have been attending Orthodox churches, and I've seen it, which is wild. And so also you're seeing this uptick in traditional Protestantism too, like Anglicanism or even High Church Lutheranism. So this thing that would have seemed unfathomable is starting to shift, and people are moving to where it appears. Now it's the early stages. These are the early adopters. There's something going on. And the beautiful thing that you would think about this, which is, and he drove this home, and that I really like, he's like, what did we do to do this? And he's like, we did nothing. Like, people just started showing up. And so if you've ever been a part of a church leadership or church planting or anything, you're always trying to figure out, well, we got to get this program, so we got to get more evangelistic. Yeah. Like if this stuff was happening, for example, and this is like at the CRC where Paul's at, because I watched so I'm such a nerd, I watched the entirety of their synod every minute last summer, right? Who does that, right? A nerd. But they were talking about, we need to be evangelistic, and this guy made this amazing speech. Paul had it on his channel, and I loved it, and so on and so forth. But they're trying to think, we got to do these things to attract people, yet there's something organic going on right now, where
Yeah.
people are seeking and walking through the doors of traditional liturgical churches without them doing any outreach, evangelism, or whatever. It's a stunning change over
I
what we
wanted
witnessed in the church.
I wanted to add to that point. Sam Tiedman made a comment on a recent, I don't remember which, it's been within the last week of a PVK, Paul Vanderklay video. And he said something about all the online converts. These people are becoming Christians on YouTube and walking into the church that Jordan Peterson's wearing on his jacket, or that Jonathan Pinchot is saying go to church. Well, I'm going to go to his church. Like, that's on YouTube. That's not through a program. That's not through an outreach event. That's not through anything. And the guys that I talk to here, it's the same thing. Like, and some of that, regardless of whether we think that's right or wrong, of it being like this, the fancy propositional word, like being drawn to the idea, it doesn't really matter because it's happening regardless. So I was just thinking, when Sam Tiedman said that from Transfigured YouTube channel, all the online converts, it was like a bomb went off in my brain. And you get it. All the programs, like this is the evangelism right now.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of reasons for it. So, for
Yeah.
example,
Well, I mean, there's the bigger, like you were talking about, there's all coming into play,
yeah,
like the
there's
desire for
the
tradition.
end of
Yeah.
modernity, and so for
Yeah.
us, the end, like American is Protestant. Like on the live stream today, Luke made this thing, and so I think one of the things, and I hope Protestants don't take offense to this, because again, if my friends, like a lot of the way I'm talking right now, they'd be like, oh yeah, dude's been just ranting about this for 15, 20 years, so same old Lance, right? So um, so I think the recession of modernity is also the recession of Reformed Protestantism. Those two are inextricably linked, right? And so now I'm not saying Protestantism is going to go away. This whole thing is going to have to merge, but that propositional, like I'm just going to say, like there's a lot that's tied up in there, and I hope Protestants aren't offended, because really you need to look in the mirror to try and figure out. Because that's what I was doing, was we were looking in the mirror trying to figure out. We're seeing these collapses and these declines. There's this the seeker thing has started to spin off and do these weird things, that's I don't know, that I think a lot of people, at any rate. So I think there's that. So there's that's going on. We had a pandemic. We see in society come apart, right? So all these things are shaking things up. But for me, I would have so I've been having these inclinations, and I grew up Methodist, so I was swimming in the evangelical milieu of the United States is Reformed. Piper, Keller. Just think about everyone who was huge in the 2000s or whatever. It's a
Louis
very
Giglio,
Reformed.
David Platt,
Yeah,
all the
and I
people.
always had this cognitive dissonance with it, because here's this, basically I'm Methodist, I'm Anglican, right?
Mhm.
Right. So there's that sensibility, right? So, and I have to be fair about that. But I never would have been able. See, I was never exposed to that orthodoxy or the early church was even a thing. But you know how I found out about it? YouTube and the internet, because that was finally open to me, and I read on my own, like there's more stuff there. So I immediately started reading early patristics, and then I'm watching Jonathan Pageau. I'm like, what is this thing? I didn't even listen. We didn't talk about this stuff in American seminaries. You breeze right past orthodoxy. It's this thing we don't really think about. And then, to be fair, Protestants, we know we do this. Catholics bad, Protestants good, right?
Mhm.
That's how I was raised. That's
Yeah.
kind of the seminary I was raised in, right? Which is like you start with what happened 500 years ago, and then you learn a whole bunch about that, right? And so, even someone who was a seeker and very curious, and you're right, like YouTube, and particularly YouTube is very powerful, and YouTube has been powerful. A lot of young men, it is Peterson, Pageau, Dyer, Josiah Trenum, those sorts of things, but also families and even young gals are finding their way into Orthodoxy through their own channels, like their own things on the YouTube. And I would tell Paul mentioned something that was really interesting. And he's starting to work on his PowerPoints around this, right? Trying to figure it out, because what he's realizing is like, okay, I can just try and protect my Protestantism and not try and see what's going on over here. He's willing to look like, okay, something's going on over here. Like what's going on, because this organic growth and shift is real and you can see it. And I do think that YouTube, particularly YouTube, but the internet in general, has opened people up to something that they never even knew existed before.
Well, and that's only going to continue to happen more and more, because I mean, so my early stuff that I was bringing here, it just was very obvious. Like one of the very first things that I experienced coming into this little corner subculture down from the J cubed guys and around Paul Vanderklay was that digitally all the walls have all fallen down between churches. And you can look over and you can see the people. There's Lance and Luke over in Orthodoxy, and there's uh, Nate up in Anglicanism, and over there's why am I going blank on Dinamores?
Kale and Catholicism,
Over Catholicism, and Paul's Reformed, and I'm
Sam
just
and
like,
Unitarianism, and yeah.
and then and I'm talking to Hezi over in Israel, and you just kind of are like, and we're hanging out, and we're just hanging out, we're bumping shoulders and banging around a little, but it's not like, what is that? And that's people that have spent a lot of time on YouTube, that a type of pluralism is inevitable. And I think, and I think that even as people are moving into the one true church, we all are moving into the one true church or something. There's still this postmodern thing that we can't kick, at least at this point in history. That's kind of like, I mean, I still think he's a Christian. And it's because it isn't being birthed out of a culture. It is being birthed propositionally, but then people are getting into embodied spaces very quickly. I found something I think that I really agree with. And this aesthetic's cool, but I'm now embodying it, and that's regardless of where you actually go. Yet, the naivete of if you're coming at this, and this isn't your story, but it is a lot of the people maybe that are getting into Orthodoxy, or seeking the high church traditions, that would have been very, polemic and high walls with their high churches. The people coming in don't feel that way. They weren't being raised that way. They just, I don't know. I think that, are you still there? I've got you paused here. Oh, there you are. But anyways, I just think that there's yeah. Okay. Well, I just think that there's something to the digital nature, the YouTube nature of what's going on, that we've been hitting on. But I want to drill down onto which. Well, I'll just add to this. Is it, and you just kind of said, is it orthodoxy or is it something bigger? And I do think that it's something, and whether it's, I don't think it's just orthodoxy, but I think orthodoxy is a big part of it. But even in my experience of how I got here to how I feel like, oh yeah, I feel like this is fine, was because when we hired an evangelical church, hired an ordained Presbyterian who liked Tim Keller and went to Yale and liked all the kind of historical things, and let's do some liturgy, like actually every week, not just as a creative thing, but let's like steer this way. To me, I was like, yeah, I as a millennial that you were talking about, very much in that space, was feeling that same kind of draw towards this, like, ancients, not just how can we be relevant with like a cool creative element, but like this feels like an authentic part of Christianity.
Yeah, I think it's I think what I think's happening here is people say things which are true. We can never go back, which I understand that sentiment of that thing, and that's true. But actually, I think God revealed patterns. I think he revealed patterns. And I think there is a way of worship and pattern that was handed down. I believe it was revealed and it was handed down. And it was patterns that, even, the foreshadowings of Christ, and we can see it in Judaism and in the fulfillment in Christ, like these things. And that's patterns in daily life. It's patterns in weekly life. It's patterns in festivals. Like there's these things that are just truer than true. Right. And Jordan Peterson is tapping in. There are these patterns that we can see and so on and so forth. And I think we've been divorced from these patterns. So I'm using this language, right? Like, I think this way of moving and being, and particularly how they work out in. So, for example, how does Orthodoxy, you participate in these daily patterns, prayer times and stuff, and so on and so forth, and Jesus prayer and fasting, like you do all this stuff, which you then go participate at the service level, and the patterns you do here are replicated in the patterns here. And then every week you're participating in the pattern of the mystical, like there's the mystical supper, right? So you do this and you're reminded of it every week, and so you're always reminded, okay, here's Mary and here's St. John the Baptist, and here, all this stuff is just pattern. But I think those are deep. And Rupert Sheldrake talks about morphic resonance, and he talks about that when you do things that our ancestors have done, like there's actually this learned behavior and there's this resonance that transcends time. I believe that when people are tapping into this, and that's why I even did a video when I talked to, I started looking at my Protestant brothers and sisters, and I started looking back what their services, even right during the Reformation period, looked like. We're much more liturgical and much more patterned, right?
Yeah.
Like, even if you see Luther's Mass, it's the divine liturgy. He just puts faith alones and stuff in there.
Yep.
Right.
But and
so
that makes it not alone, actually.
Right. And so I think we start coming into Vatican II, right? And I think it starts with Vatican II, and then you have the Jesus movement and this relevance movement, and we've thinned things out a little bit. I think ultimately that's why when I say this, it really angers people. And I'm not saying what you're doing is wrong or whatever, but I think what we're seeing is people are realizing the thinness of a rock concert and a TED Talk is not gonna prevail, and it's not the depth that people intuitively deep down know that they want to participate in. I think that's it.
Well, I want to add to that, if I'm going to catch up to you through our slow internet connection. I want to add a few points to that, and I agree with you. You talked about Luther's Mass being wrapped in the solas being wrapped in Luther's Mass. They weren't sola, actually. If you think about it, they were in the context of that time, but they were so embodied. It's when you thin that out and you keep the solas, but you thin out the service or the pattern, that we have some problems. The other thing I wanted to a thread I wanted to pluck on was that, Martin Shaw talks about the rewilding of Christianity. Well, in a sense, what if the Jesus movement was the wilding of Christianity? That in a large scale pattern of Jesus going out to the desert and fasting, or the tabernacling of Moses and the Exodus, like, for us to really cherish the patterns that we had been given, we had to probably, on a scale, separate ourselves from those.
No, I think that's
in
really
a way.
good. And yep.
And then the other piece I wanted to kind of go with was, so in our, I've talked to you previously about our kind of home church that we're still stumbling around trying to figure out where to telos, where to aim and so that we can land in something. So one of the families that we're close to, we're talking about, the husband could do his job anywhere. And so we could just there's nothing tying us here. And I pushed back. I said, there's so much tying you here. And they weren't saying it in a and it was a deprecating thing, like, I mean, we're not doing a lot. And I was just like, because they had like homeschooled their kids, so they weren't as community minded people, like they weren't like super socialites. They had been very, very big parts of like our old church, very, but I was like, this guy's a second generation doing what his dad did in our community. We meet in their home where there's lots of relationships. I was like, that's this very modern mindset that we are just our job and everything else is arbitrary. And that is what part of the pattern stuff in the hierarchy that you're talking about, going from here to here to here, is that this, we're saying that this is just arbitrary. And it's separate. You can worship God anywhere. And that's very individualistic, which I'm not criticizing them for, because that's the whole culture. That's not like, what are you guys thinking? You're thinking what everybody thinks, like,
that's the essence of enlightenment, right? Like
yes,
that whole, and in America, rugged individualism. Yeah, totally.
yeah. And even I'll say this, and McMo's not here to defend himself. So but we had a long conversation. He was your sparring partner on this last stream from that, yesterday. And he talked about something along the lines of, he even said like a bunch of individuals and their relationship with God, like, and then that's where everything goes out from the individual. And yes, but it doesn't just go individual and then individual into this space and then individual into this space and then individual into this space. You go from individual to family to community and then to church community. And then you take the telos and you take where we're going to take what we're built on. This is not arbitrary and individual separated from this. They're inextricably tied. That's human. And you take that into, so here's our community and our life and our family. And then we have our church feast or our calendar celebration and this weekly whatever. And then we take that and we bring that in. And maybe at the point when we're all in worship, maybe we're not all looking at each other at this point. And I think that's sometimes, even for the people that have walked away from stodgy corporate traditions where they don't feel like there's personal connection at this point, it's because these other pieces aren't considered part of this piece.
Right.
So if this idea, kind of the ortho bro idea of this idyllic community, and then we're all doing this together, then we're all doing, like, there's truth to that. But I think that's part of the reason. It's like rubbing up the individualism, but it's like there's just all these pieces jumbled around, and it's hard to.
Well, and I think so. Here's something I've been ruminating on this, right? And so my wife was talking to one of her friends and was trying to explain what Orthodoxy was, right? And one of the things she came back with, and I get it, and it's the Protestant impulse. It's like, I want to go to church to be free, to worship, and to have the experience that I want to have, right? And so, and it looks like there's all these rules or whatever. And, which I think is a perfectly, like, that's a, like, I've heard that a lot, right? And my thing is, what I've realized is, and I can even tie this back to my Methodist youth, right? I have the whole week to be individual. But Sunday, when I come together, like when we come together and we all know the prayers that we're going to be praying, and hopefully we've been doing it in our own personal lives. But when we all come together with one voice, one heart, one accord, and we all know exactly, here we are, right? We're coming to do one thing, one body, and if you really get into it, all of a sudden you're coming together into a body, and everyone knows what you're doing, what's coming next. It's all stuff, and then, you can set aside your individualism and your need for your own personal experience and feeling for 2 hours or 3 hours on a Sunday to join with everyone in one movement and one action. You can, for the rest of the week, Like, in fact, do the pattern prayers. But those, I mean, even if you were an amazing Orthodox prayer person and who has a job and a family or whatever, let's say you do an hour of those a day. Well, you have 23 other hours where you can talk to Jesus personally and do like all that stuff's still there, right?
Yeah.
But it's this sense of laying down the individual to become part of, and so even though you don't know that's happening, it is happening, right? And so even though you're unaware of the pattern and what you're doing, it's this thing that comes together. And again, in America, and in particularly the Protestant impulse of rugged individualism, right? And then also this idea is I'm going to church. I want to go to church to be filled, right? I want to
And
go to church
yeah,
to
consume,
learn, right? I,
consume.
I want to go to church to have this experience. I want you to take me to the heavenlies, right? All good things in and of. I'm not saying that, but instead of I'm going to church to participate with my brothers and sisters with a singular focus. The other thing that it does is it focuses you all unilateral, like all at the same place. And it's not, see, emotions can wane and move and being slain, like that stuff. And sometimes it is slain in the spirit. But here's the other thing. See, I'm a charismatic Christian, right? That's what I really am, right? And Paul talked about that, like that charismatics are immanentized to the max, right? But what I couldn't go to charismatic churches because the charismatic churches, every one of them has gone off the rails in some respect. And I always had this sense there was too much chaos and not enough order, right? And there's always a special revelation somebody has, and it's like it just got weird. Like I just knew immediately, like this isn't it. And so I what I've realized is that's something I've lived in, and I've been in it for 4 years now, right? And then I can tie it back to being young Methodist Lance, who I just told you earlier. I knew where I was. We all had the doxologies, the responses. We all knew the hymns. We knew exactly we're going to do this at this point and this at this point. We were
Yeah.
going to pray this, and there wasn't extemporaneous prayer going on because, again, like I mentioned with you earlier on C.S. Lewis, he's like, how can you participate in extemporaneous prayer? Because you got to listen. Is this something I can agree with? So you're listening and then you're supposed to say amen at the end, but I don't know, like you said some wild thing there in the middle that's really not part of this. And I can't say an amen to that. Like it creates this wild thing. And there's something about liturgical practices. And you even mentioned something which was so deep and it's true. And I remembered it is like when you said when you were having some personal struggles, and I know I've had to give sermons and stuff, and it's wild when you're living a life and you're failing and everything else, and then you got to get up in front of people and everything else. Like I don't know if people have done that. Like it's a wild thing because you want to be, I don't know, you want to be holy, like you want to write out, like you want to be like you're sincere, and then you just got to fight with your wife the next day, and now you're talking about patience and love on a Sunday. I would usually tell on myself, but still, it's like you said when you offered up these more liturgical, or even if you're singing the Psalms or whatever, you're like what you loved is that it wasn't it wasn't on me that I had to give them some piece of me. It was this thing that I could offer up that we could participate in. And
And not only
that because you mentioned that, like that struck you, and you knew, wait a minute, there's something powerful in that.
and the thing, a lot of times, even whenever I did then and do on then I do now is when we say a creed together or we say a confession together. A lot of times I say this when we say the creed together, is that you're hearing the person to your left and the person to your right. You're hearing the person in front of you. You're hearing the person behind you. All say this. We're saying the quiet things out loud together, and it's not arbitrary like you're talking about. It's not arbitrary. It's not in that rote religion, wherever that came from. I don't know, but it's not arbitrary. And even if you think it's dead, there is something to the collective spirit that's there, the collective attention, uh, to more or less greater degrees or lesser degrees. But it's a big deal to hear people say that. And if the bass is nice and the kick, if it's you're just there for your individual, like your wife's friend was kind of saying, there's also a lack of discipline there, which, not to her, I'm just saying at large, like that the whole seeker impulse was to make it as like zero barrier to entry. Come to church. You like rock concerts? You like a good talk? Come to church. You, but if you don't like religious imagery, or if certain things about these creeds challenge you, or if you don't like hearing yourself, like we don't want you to feel any self-consciousness. And just come exist, and then maybe in that space you can have a transcendent experience. And I think even Joseph said something about that while y'all were talking with Pink Mosif. But that to me was the other piece of being a practitioner, and continues to be, like the rhythms that when people can get into that space, can get into hearing that and doing that work together. I think the same impulse actually is what started partially the Jesus and the Passion thing, is because there was a lot of unified, like in my youth group, if we're all like, everybody decides to sing this new chorus or
Oceans,
something.
baby.
I mean, I'm talking way before that, like the Heart of Worship, or Here I'm, like,
Oh yeah.
if you have 50 kids all singing that together with an acoustic guitar, that's much more congregational, and it's like that impulse of, we got to capture this and let's take it to the masses. And then that is actually not what's happening when you have a really good rock concert on Sunday. Is not this communal thing that you were experiencing in youth group, or like for me in my generation, it started in youth group. Like I wasn't an adult when that hit like it did for you, but that was and there was a lot of rhythm, and we're in this, and we can all kind of feel that we're doing this together, and where the next thing is, or something. But like, that doesn't happen on a Sunday morning when you walk in and your kid was banging around in the car, making his sister mad, and dad just yelled at mom, and and you walk in, it's like, if you have to think about it too much, or like find your individual thing, but I think that you can set some of that aside. If you're familiar with the liturgy, you can kind of transcend that stuff to participate in a religious embodied act. But that doesn't mean it's mindless, and I guess it can be. And I think
Well,
that's probably the
God
continuum.
uses all things according to his good purposes. And I was a part of those movements, and I have friends who are in those movements. These, I want people to hear this. These are sincere people seeking God. It's all good, man. Like you know what I mean? Like, it's there, but there's this, but ultimately it's this thing that I saw and I would say I would say, I, I didn't, it wasn't working. Right. And so, and I know that's offense, but I was seeing it just in terms of numbers and everything else, and talking to my friends who were those sorts of pastors, and we're watching, how are we getting people that are actually living the life, like all that stuff, you know. I'll let, so again, I'm not trying to denigrate that in any way, but there's something that is just missing. And then the other thing that I think that has happened is, like, I still listen to worship music, right? But I find that the music I'm still listening to, actually, I would call Orthodox. But then the thing that's happened is like, so here's the thing that happened to me sometimes, like, really weird. I couldn't figure it out. It's like, the Jesus is my boyfriend worship music and soaking songs. And then the sermon would be a angry God PSA sort of thing. And it's like, wait a minute, this, like, how is Jesus is my boyfriend worship feeling we had going on here? And then I'm coming with this, like,
I'll tell
Mark
you why,
Driscoll
Lance.
message.
I'll tell you why, because there wasn't any liturgy to line that out appropriately.
Right.
Think about, I can tell you that. So in a recent liturgy that I set up, it's like, okay, so we sang like a something simple about worshiping God. And then we have like a prayer of adoration. And then we have a song that's about the gospel, a song that and it says a gospel song, and it tells the story of the gospel. And then we have a confession of sin. And then we have silent confession, and then we have an assurance of that pardon and of forgiveness. And then we sing a song about God's love that would be something more akin to Jesus is my boyfriend. but like, but because it makes sense, like what you're saying is like, without a framework for why you're and you just have the music, you just have the sermon, you can't, you can be more intentional with it, but it makes everything feel kind of arbitrary. Like you're saying, it's like, well, I mean, this song's about God's love and this sermon's about God's judgment, but how did that all happen? And then it's like, what do I do? So I think that, I don't know. I do want to, we haven't even gotten to what's going on in Montana. Let's unpack that.
Yeah. So there's an interesting thing that's been going on. And I also think the internet, let's come back to the internet. I think the internet is driving a lot of this. And so there's this church in Missoula, Montana called Zootown. And this pastor, Scott, I think it's Klaus or Clout or something like that. But at any rate, they've decided to basically embrace Orthodox theology. Okay. And what happened to him was he started, he says it, he has, he was on a podcast. I think I've shared it on X, and I hadn't heard his background story. He went through a bit of a Reformed theology deconstruction and hit a moment of existential crisis. Like, he talked about how I came off and like I didn't like really believe what I just taught there, and he was just, and so then he started to seek. Brad Jerzak, who wrote a book called A More Christ-Like Way. He's definitely kind of an ultimate reconciliation kind of guy. He spends a lot of time going to evangelical churches, talking basically, I would just say it's basically getting rid of kind of I know Amsman got mad at me, the novel switch to PSA and so on and so forth. But so at any rate, he started to go down this path. And what I could relate to him is he started to ask questions, and then he started to read about the early church, and then he started talking to an Orthodox priest. All of a sudden, his whole theology transformed. And he started, so his church, and there was a church split, and he talks about this, and the people who stayed kind of went through this transformation with him. And effectively, they're trying to embrace Orthodoxy in an evangelical way. There's a church in St. Joseph, Missouri. Brian Zahn is his name. Yeah. They've been doing this for a while too. So anyway, I've seen it, and Brad Jerzak goes around to a lot of evangelical churches, although he converted to Orthodoxy and he's a deacon in the Orthodox church now. His wife stayed outside of Orthodoxy, by the way. Very interesting. But he goes to evangelical churches and basically is trying to communicate, quite frankly, more of the Orthodox Church says this, and this is true. They view the church as the hospital, that we're in need of healing. It's not a courtroom where we need to get our justice, God's anger and justice, and damnation removed from us. It's just a totally different way of viewing things. So he went through that, and so then he started. So his church is now embracing, as much so, which is wild. And the priest mentioned this. He got permission from his bishop. He's had this Orthodox priest that has come and spoke and done a sermon for his evangelical church multiple times, which is fascinating. And I think you're going to see, when you and I started talking about, there's these shifts that are happening, and it's not just about pattern and form. But I think that many of us who were never exposed to, because we all know what Catholicism is, right? And so much way of looking at things. People are being exposed to that more, and they're like, whoa.
Yeah, some of that broke up for me, but I mean, being exposed to It was really just the last like 15 seconds that kind of broke up. But being exposed to either the history and the interesting thing about somebody like Brian Zahn, I mean, he goes way back. I mean, he's around your age probably, right? You know, he
Mhm.
goes way back into the emerging church. And then it's funny that it's landing in Orthodoxy because he kind of, I mean, he was kind of an interesting player. He didn't quite fit liberal conservative in his journey to a degree. And then,
He's
but that,
definitely anti-Christian right? So he's definitely
yeah.
that.
And I just didn't feel like he completely fit into the progressive thing. Um, Whenever I was still following him, probably, you know, I'll get 7, 8 years ago or something. But
Mhm.
then coming all the way from this emerging and this is the pattern. Oh, let's look. And I mean, I'm in it. I'll be, oh, look at this cool historical thing. Let's bring this in as like a creative thing. That's the Gen X impulse,
Mhm.
by like I know that, and because that's what I was brought into, and then it's like,
Yeah,
oh,
so like
well,
his screens have icons on them a lot. So
yeah, there's
their screens, it's funny, he has the screens, but then he has, and some of them are modern icons, which are probably very cool, by the way. I think it's Ivana Demchuk or whatever. He uses a lot of her. But like even on Easter, I believe it was last year or the year before, he talked everyone through the Orthodox, the icon of the resurrection. So he did this very, so it's, yeah, so he's an interesting guy, and he's exposing a lot of people to those things.
and that's kind of a weird synthesis because it's not just gonna be like you said, everybody is gonna go to Orthodoxy, but what it kind of influence when this as it begins to the floodgates of this, and I think that you know, if Father Young used to be Presbyterian, uh, Peugeot was Baptist, like, you don't leave those impulses behind. He was a missionary. Peugeot was a missionary.
Right.
That's not a real part of me anymore. You know, like, um, you know, even DeYoung didn't
Definitely a modern. He's an apostle. He's an
yeah,
apostle. JBP's an apostle. These are apostles.
and DeYoung as being a cerebral reformed person isn't gonna just, "Oh, well, I'm gonna check my brain at the door now that I'm in Orthodoxy, like, I'm not gonna be a cerebral Orthodoxy person." You know, like, and that those things are creating actually synthesis more than they're just creating, "You were this, and now you're this." You know, like, and I think
Yeah.
that
You know
that
what the
maybe
interesting thing in Orthodoxy is, which people struggle with? So Stephen DeYoung got his doctorate in biblical stuff through Reformed biblical schools, right? And he would hold to more of an eternal separation view, right? And so he definitely has that, and he's fully, like, he gives communion. He's in great good standing as a priest and everything else. And then you have someone like Bishop Callistos Ware, who really is kind of the apostle to the West, and he was a hopeful universalist. Yet he was a bishop in good standing and served communion. So one of the things that's really wild about Orthodoxy is it's a huge tent. Like, you've got the creed, and there are certain things, essence and energies, like they'll all agree on. There's certain aspects, Trinity, like you're not going to find a Unitarian Orthodox guy, that sort of thing. But for all these other things that you can't really, like, there's this, like, all this liberty and freedom down here, when people try and find their way into that, Christian. So for example, my wife is a very literal person, and then I'll watch Father DeYoung say something, then I'll watch a Callistos Ware video, and she'll go, "Wait a minute, they're saying different things." I'm like, "Yeah, you just have to get used to that, because there's, like, a lot of freedom."
yeah, and I just the you were I think it was you that was pointing to that maybe it's the Antiochian church is that the one that went up to Montana that is trying to make that bridge?
With the Zooton Church,
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'll figure that. I'm not sure I'm not sure if that priest is in any of.
Are they gonna what to I guess here's what I want to drill down on that is Are they, when they say they want to embrace Orthodox, they aren't going to become an Orthodox church, but they want to teach Orthodox teaching and still operate relatively
Yeah,
modern?
he basically is come to believe and has a lot of sermons about the problems with Reformation theology, right? And the novel things that came in around that time. And so, if you can think about that, it's like basically it's a rejection of Reformation theology, and he points to all these things, and then also communism was a big problem for him, so he got all that. And so embracing Orthodox theology. I think in the end, so Father Barnabas Powell, who's a Greek Orthodox priest who, you know, is his church is really booming. He was very big in the Protestant world and like even evangelical TV world and everything else. And he came to this realization himself, and he was trying to straddle the line. And then ultimately he went to the church and said, guys, we might as well just all become Orthodox. And so most of his church decided to become Orthodox. He went to go to the Orthodox seminary, even though he had his Bible learned and everything else, and he became a priest. And then ultimately their entire congregation became Orthodox. So you're going to see some people are going to try and pardon me.
What does that look like? Like, what is worship? Like, if they go from being 4 songs in a sermon, and then, but it's the same building and roughly the same congregation. What does that look like?
I think what you first would see is first you'll start talking. You'll basically adopt Orthodox theology in viewpoint. So it starts there. Then you probably would see they'd probably start bringing in more liturgical prayer and stuff like that, if you would think how that would work in an evangelical church. And then, so some may want to continue to straddle that line. So for example, Brian Zahn certainly embraces a ton, like basically it's Orthodox theology. Yeah, and he's just found his way he's doing it. I don't see his church becoming Orthodox.
Right.
And they'll do, so what would it be? It would be Orthodox theology in an evangelical context. So you still have the worship music, you still do all the things, but like what Brian Zahn has done is that, so they're trying to get people to do liturgical prayer. So like on Wednesdays, they have a prayer room where they go up, and what do? They do a prayer rule, right? And they have a prayer class, and how are they teaching their people to pray? They're teaching them to pray the prayers of the hours in the Orthodox prayer rules. They're using Orthodox. So in an evangelical context, they're trying to teach people how to pray liturgically. So that's how it can kind of look in an evangelical sense. And then ultimately what will happen is, and so this is where I came down, right? Why am I not doing an ortho house church? I just ultimately I'm like, why recreate the wheel, dude? Like, it's there. Like, just go join and participate in that thing that exists. Like, you don't need to recreate the wheel.
With Zahn, I mean, his church, I would guess, still hover somewhere around 1,000 people. I mean, it's been like that for a while. I don't know if they're bigger or smaller than they, but like, yeah. So you have this thing where it's like, okay, well, I've built this, I've given my life to this. I mean, he's been there a long time, and I embrace this theology, and we're going to incorporate these practices. And it's interesting. So I had an Anglican priest try to encourage me to do the same thing. Almost like we could set you up where we could have a priest come into your house and like help administer sacrament or something, but y'all kind of keep doing this thing like to a degree. And what am I trying to? Yeah, I just think we're going to see a lot more weird, like a lot more of. There's going to be direct shifts, but there's also going to be like the Protestant evangelical impulse to incorporate and create or something. But at the same time,
in a simple sense, Christian, who's going to determine what happens to that church? It's going to be the head pastor.
Yeah.
If that pastor wants to continue being a pastor and pastoring in a church in that context, and doesn't want to, maybe either A, he may not be able to be an Orthodox priest. So they don't just let everyone be an Orthodox priest, right? or doesn't want to go through what Father Powell had to go through, which was go back to an Orthodox seminary, do all the stuff to become a priest. So, basically, if they want to continue on, they'll do evangelical orthodoxy. But it will come down to that individual pastor if ultimately he's like, oh, dang, we just need to join the Orthodox Church. And so maybe I'll be a priest, maybe I won't. But guys, let's just go join here. And I think, I think for many of them, probably they could go down the pathway to becoming an Orthodox priest. And so you would align yourself with the Greek or the Antiochans, whatever, some Orthodox, where they would help you transition and come into the body. And so those members would need to be baptized or chrismated, and then they would have to join the Orthodox Church, and then your pastor would have to go through the steps to become a priest, and then eventually you would have your parish. And again, let's think about this, which is a lot for me. Like, one of the things my wife struggled with, she's like, because she married, she's like, but you're not going to be able to be a pastor. Like, what does that even mean? I'm like, yeah, I know. I don't know. Jesus just called me here, and it was Jesus, right? The Holy Spirit took me there. And it's like, yeah, it just is what it is. So I've got to be willing to lay down anything when I know that God has called me to some place. And, it could play out in a lot of different ways within an Orthodox church, so on and so forth. Could you be a deacon or whatever? And I don't think they're taking a 54-year-old guy like me and going to make him a priest or whatever. That's a time for a different day. But see, but it doesn't matter. Like, once I know I'm in the place I'm supposed to be. But this is the thing so here's one thing that I am in 12-step groups, right? And how it works. They talk about one thing, or one thing that talks about a lot of things. But there's one sentence talking about people coming on this path, and they talked about some of us have tried to hold on to our old ideas, and the result was nil until we let go absolutely. Okay. One of the things that had to happen to me in my journey and my connection with Christ is when I had my slain in the spirit road to Damascus moment, and I was a Christian dude or whatever, what my mindset was as I was reading the big book, and right before I had that moment, I had opened up to the idea that God could be anything in the universe, and it didn't have to be Christ. I was just opened up to the creator of the universe. You know what I mean? Like, I was willing to lay Christ on the altar. And then I had the most powerful experience I ever had in the Holy Spirit and with Christ, right? Which is a wild thing. And so a lot of people aren't willing to put even their propositions and their confessions and the way they view things. They aren't willing to put that on there. See, the one thing that I am at the end of the day, what I'm very, very convinced of is like, I'm unafraid. And I've told my sons this. I don't really know if I have stuff figured out. All I know is Jesus lived and is real and is our Savior. So I don't know what that looks like, but don't hold to any confession or church or whatever. Go wherever Jesus leads you, because he will always lead you to the right place. Because I don't know. I'm struggling to figure this stuff out. So, if you are a true Christian and you believe Christ is real and died and resurrected and ascended and all this other sort of stuff, you don't have to worry about. You have to be willing to lay all this stuff on the altar.
Yeah, you do. I think, and I love that, because that's not being certain about a lot of things. It's having a lot of faith in one thing, and
the person of Jesus Christ. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And the thing, I guess, what was kind of tugging at me from back a little bit is this Brian's on thing. I think I remember you mentioning that maybe in our last conversation or somewhere. So it's like, it's been in there, but we tend to think that when somebody makes a decision that it's a static thing. Because even you can't predict where Lance is, what's Lance going to be in 10 years. I mean, it's not that I don't want to put that on you. I'm not trying to, that's not a question of your character. That's not a question of anything. I'm just saying that about all of us. And I'm saying
further in. I'm certain. I've been so certain about certain things in my 20s that I know that we're exactly wrong now.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about Brian, and y'all, like I said, I think y'all are probably the same age. It'll be interesting that will be a very interesting, him in particular, because, if he says basically I'm Orthodox without being Orthodox or something, I don't know how he would define himself.
Yeah, I don't think that's how he would define himself. But for a guy who understands Orthodox theology now and watches him, like I don't know how he would define that. But that's certainly the way that he thinks, writes, talks, preaches. I see the things that he's doing in his church, and I think in essence he tried to take the best of what he was trying to take these elements, whether that be the theology or practice or whatever, and he's trying to bring it into a context that is more palatable, probably for his congregation and so on and so forth. So I've watched a ton of his sermons. I like, again, like anybody, I don't agree with everything, but I like it, and I found it fascinating because when I was first coming in here, with my wife's immediate kind of like, ugh, I don't want to do this orthodoxy thing. So early on, I was asking myself the question. I'm like, well, do we go to a church like that, right? Where at least I can feel like I feel comfortable with the theology and all that the stuff that I've been heavily persuaded in, that I think is very biblical and it matches reality and concepts, everything else. Um, could I do something like that, or do I do a house church like that? Like I was wrestling with those sorts of things. And I ultimately came down on the situation because I was practicing Orthodoxy and I was attending all the services. I was like, no, this stuff is all here for me, and it's working, and I'm gonna join. This is it for me. So, but people are going to have different places along the spectrum, and I also, again, with his also being a hopeful universalist, like I don't think it matters for your salvation whether or not I convince you one way or another. I'm firmly convinced, and I would just say this: I'm firmly convinced that the Orthodox Church is the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church that has been delivered unto the saints, and I think it most faithfully represents what was happening, the fulfillment that happened, and the continuation. It's not a separate story. The continuation of God's revelation throughout history, and what the Orthodox Church does is what Christ revealed and handed to us. So I believe that fully, and that's why I'm joining it, right? I also understand Christ is everywhere present, filling all things. Christ, my seeking of him was real and genuine, and he was acting on me and leading me and slaying me in the spirit, and all those things were happening. And so I also know that the Holy Spirit and God is existing. He's everywhere present, filling all things, even my enemies. And he is participating in the megachurch and the house church and Catholicism and Anglicanism. Like I know that's happening too. But we all have to pick our place where we're persuaded. And then ultimately, I just try to think this, and this is this individual thing, but that's the thing we have to do. What what helps transforms me and roots me in Christ the best, and then ultimately allows me to be the person who is transformed in a way that my neighbor notices it, not that I have to tell him, and then ask me. This is a 12-step principle too. People come up and go, I want what you have. Attraction rather than promotion. And that's what we're seeing kind of in Orthodoxy. So for me, I lived that out. I found this thing that I was trying to do. Like I was writing devotional guides, and I had all this stuff I was doing to try and call people into the life. And then I'm like, dude, like it's all here, man. Just do the stuff they've been doing for thousands of years. And then the other thing that I think about, which is I think charismatics, and here's something like, dead prayers or whatever, like for a lot of us, they, they connect to it in that way, and it's become just this thing for them, right? It's probably they're probably more secularly minded, and so they're not caught up in the wonder of what's really happening, kind of in an Orthodox service. But when I bring myself to that in that way and participate, deeply and so on and so forth, um, it's it's very impactful. So
Yeah, and one of the things, if you kind of zooming out, like when you think about the inner, what is strength? We're looking for strong things to hold on to in a crisis of meaning and in a crisis of all this. What's we can't really see what we used to think we could kind of see what was coming. Um, that Orthodoxy having survived a lot of, and still surviving a lot of persecution in a really serious way, in a different way than Protestantism in the West with state churches and in America, uh, that we're looking for a strength, and that something that it sounds like with the spiritual practice. And even I loved something you were saying on that live stream yesterday about, well, you said that the verse that used to bother you, was it you who said this? The verse that used to bother you the most was when Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Somebody was saying
That
this.
wasn't me, but yeah, somebody said it. Yeah.
Maybe it was somebody Luke was talking to this morning. Jed, maybe in that I don't remember, like that exclusive verse. And it's funny because that's like my definition of my faith. Like that verse that Jesus said, and that somehow maybe the experience that you're finding, something that I'm continuing to try to find more of, is how to become stronger, not better, not smarter, but like stronger, like a stronger faith. And I think that, even that phrase, we want to have disciples that make disciples. What is a disciple? Is it just somebody that believes, that you're trying to get somebody else to
I think
believe?
there's the mere Christianity in that it was the same thing I felt before, and it's absolutely the penultimate goal of what Orthodoxy try to do is make us more Christ-like.
Yes. And, but there's like that, but that's not, and I think that's what the impulse is. Oh, make disciples, make somebody more like Christ. But what that is in certain contexts is like so vague, so simple. Well, what is that? Come be a greeter, and then be a small group leader, and read and pray. Do your quiet time or do a devotional, and go to church on Sunday. Like, tell me there's more.
Yeah.
But
Well,
there's
the scary thing
not.
is that actually the call that Christ gives us, which is, I think, when it comes to where I think Christ was the most non-relevant seeker guy in the world. Like he told people the truth, man, and stuff that they didn't want to hear, right? And when the
Yeah.
crowds would come, he'd generally give a hard teaching and they'd disperse and leave, right? And very few would remain. And I think one of the things like Jordan Peterson, particularly like in young men right now that they do this, is that to try and make the bar so low without actually like saying like the beatitudes, right? Like when Jesus starts setting that stuff out, dude, are you kidding me? That's hard stuff. And then he starts talking about, you can look at a woman with lust, it's adultery. You got to pray for your enemies, bless those who persecute you. It's like, what are we even talking about here? Like that's what I always like, what are you talking about, Jesus? But then he also tells us, right after that, in right after the Sermon on the Mount, he tells us how to do it: pray, fast, and give alms. Right. So we get these practices. Like there's this way of life that can helpfully get you into that beatific way of living. And so, Jesus challenges you at the very core of your humanity to live very differently than the world is calling you to live. I mean, that's so fundamental. Like you can't read the red letters and not. So again, this has nothing to do with Orthodoxy. I was the guy who's been talking about this because it became obvious to me, like God is either everything or he's nothing. Like that's obvious. And I also knew for myself, I'm either all in or I'm lukewarm, not doing like, so again, like, yes, I am a guy who tends towards extremity, but I'm just telling you, that's what Jesus, it's incontrovertible. He was calling you to that extremity. Like you will only, you gain your life, you lose your life for me to gain it, right? What does it profit you to gain whole world, lose your soul? Like, pick up your cross and follow me. And yeah, it's also my burden is you, my yoke is light. Like it's all the things, like it is all those things, but make no mistake, the only thing he asks of you is everything. And it's not because it's some rules or everything else. It's because We have a good Father who wants what's best for us. And Jesus is the exact representation of the Father, as it's mentioned, the image of the Father, as it mentions in Hebrews. And we've seen while we were the world nailing him to the cross, he's saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.
So you're
Like,
telling
it's
me
wild, dude.
you're telling me that you can still share the gospel even though that you're Orthodox? Are you telling me that's possible?
I think it might be.
Man, this has been awesome. I love how we were able to kind of come back to this and riff and think out loud, and I don't know, and that you want to, even though I'm still sitting in a house church on Sundays right now, that you're like, you know what I mean? That there's
I
something
want you.
still,
Yep.
there's something
I
that's
want you to
still,
keep doing that house church
yeah, there's something
until
that's
Jesus
still,
calls you to do something else. Until Jesus calls you to do something else, I want you to continue in that house. So this is where I drive people crazy. Like, well, this guy's talking over both sides of my mouth. No, I'm not. Like, I'm not, because that's where you're supposed. That's where you're called to be. And I think he's given you a group of people to shepherd and to bring together. And I don't know where you guys are going to end up, but you don't have to worry about where you're going to end up, because he'll decide where you're going to end up. And one of the things I'd like to come back and talk about, which is I'd like to reverse this a little bit, is I, I'm kind of following you and I'm watching on your channel and you're working through that. So what I'm most interested to you is, here you're this guy who's come out of this worship leader pastor role, and now you're recognizing liturgy and you're struggling with that in your house church context. Like, I find your story fascinating.
well, uh, where you, what I believe is that this is not a destination, like you're saying. And it seems like, even in with your story with your pastor, that changed that whole model, that probably I'm making an assumption that the impetus with that, this is the destination. That house church is the destination for, and maybe he's still doing that. I don't know, but that's what and I don't feel like this is the destination or the 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 cure all for American anything or whatever. Like, I do feel like it's contextual, and that it's Christians, but that it's Christians that are trying to heal. Even maybe in that orthodoxy, what is the church? It's a place. It's a hospital. I mean, these people are hurt. We were all like, it was the whole church hurt thing. It's the church hurt thing, but it's true. It's just it. And the difference for my wife is very undergrad in psychology. She just got accepted into grad school to be a therapist. Very intuitive on this. There was just this real sense that when something devastating happens, and maybe it's intuitive because we've experienced devastation in our own lives in a very real way, that the best idea actually generally isn't to just like pretend like it didn't happen and go somewhere else to where nobody really cares. But maybe you can't stay there because it's it was too devastating. And so that's kind of the undercurrent. But and again, the other undercurrent isn't, it's like, hey guys, this is the next great idea. It was like, okay, here's about 10, 15 families that like all went here for 10 years, but they aren't the kind of people that's like, oh, we're gonna find the next answer to church. It's just like, y'all want to meet and do this together. Like, that's it. We're not inviting friends. We're not evangelizing the world. We don't think we have something. But my history and my I know how to do church. I know how to make it happen. I know how to make church happen on Sunday. Like that's what I did. I did that longer than I've done anything else. Make church happen on Sunday, and so I've thought a lot about it. That I wasn't just going along like, oh, I was evaluating, what am I doing, and oh, these people have a lot more a different perspective, and I'm interested in that. I'm curious about that. So it's always been the case, and so then, so yeah, I am kind of I'm not the only one, and I needed it to not be the only one to make church happen. Like that was actually very important, and so um, especially even just from how it looks, like from the like, and so there's bringing in a liturgist, and that we have another we do a Bible story, and part of that is out of necessity, but it's this weird, things I think about. You probably bumped into Jonathan Haidt and Anti-Fragile America, and does that Jonathan Haidt?
Mhm.
Yeah. So like,
Mhm.
so we don't have Sunday school, but like basically everybody under 10 after the Bible story, we do a passing of the peace to get ready for our sermon, and they just go play in this yard with rollerblades and stuff. And 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 I'm kind of like, as long as y'all are getting this Bible story, like from my heart and from the heart of the people there, it's like, wow, that's a, and we're all, that's so important to me. And that's kind of a Jordan Peterson thing, but it's just like, I want them to have the stories. I want my children and the children here to have the stories. And so, as long as my son will pay attention for 10 minutes to that story, go play, and we'll listen to this guy talk
Mhm.
for 30 or 40 minutes.
Mhm.
And the other piece of it is that this is weird technological times. So, when the church that originally, this a contingent of this church hired me when I was 16 because they were using Chris Tomlin on the CD player. So it's like, okay, we want a real person doing this. Well, it's interesting now, like you've got the music and the liturgy stuff taken care of. We don't have the preaching taken care of. So we're not, oh, well, that's easy now too. You could pick any amazing preacher from all over the United States that you wanted to. Everybody's doing it now. Who do we want? We want the guy that pastored this church for 10 years. And he sometimes makes jokes about, like, he's out in California, and he sometimes makes jokes about people even that are in our little house church as an illustration. And we're laughing along. It's so strange. And I asked him if he would just do like a little hey, it's a Holy Week's coming up. Would you do like a little 5-minute little video just introducing Holy Week for us? I'll show, just say hi to everybody. And yeah, man. And he used to be my boss, it's like, um, so it's a weird, like, because what it's centered around is trust. Like the whole thing is centered around trust, and it's not even, and it's centered around, care, just like a very, like these long time relationships. And it's not centered around, we're going to start this thing, we're going to change the world, we're going to get everybody to this new novel idea, we're going to, like, I said where I was from, oops. But like, so like, this is like, yeah. And then there's this piece of some of the, like, we have like this little charter group of 5 families that I'm gonna bring in some things that just go through my mind. So John here's here, Tomada, Orthodox guy, right? You know what I'm talking about?
Oh yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
Why are we
So
talking about rabbits?
okay, so when I first bumped into him a little bit before, probably Symbolic World, and he's talking about Tomada, and I'm listening to him talk, and I'm like, okay, there's a lot here. There's a lot here. So when we meet, we're at my in-laws, and they have this giant wooden table. It's real long. It can seat like 15 people or something. So we meet there. We've been meeting there when we have like a little leadership group, like, well, how are we going to do Holy Week? And so, and I thought, what if I make a toast? Like with my red Solo cup and our chili bowls, not like Tomada, candlelight, and blah, blah, but it's like, okay. So that, like, and oh, well, let's do a feast. during, and what's Wednesday during Holy Week? Oh, Spy Wednesday. Interesting. So what's Spy? Oh, that's Judas. Okay. All right. Uh, on Wednesday, we get together just for a fellowship, and I make a point to do a reading, just a short reading, and say something like, "We all, why can we celebrate? Because we all actually have a little Judas inside of us, and that's who Christ forgives." But it's like these aren't like massive, deep historical things, but it's just like it's pointing. It's just pointing at, and it's trying to connect. Like how can I connect to the past in a way that's simple yet profound, yet without being like I've got to go on a quest to start. So, those are just that's what's going through my mind. But I am just an individual and a part of this, but we we just keep showing up right now, and I think we are getting to the point where it's like, okay, we do have to make a decision of not continuing to exist. And everyone has thoughts and ideas inside their heart, and maybe we haven't talked about them out loud. So let's come together as our little charter group and put it on the table and kind of see. I think that's where that's where we're at on the journey, and so that we can. I mean, from my opinion, it means that we need to aim at something that's pre-existing, not try to create something that's we think is novel. And so I don't know, and there's some ideas behind that I'm not going to say out here, but but yeah. So I don't know, man. That's where it's happening, and the liturgy is very well. This past Sunday was really special. I don't even know how to put word. It felt very spiritual, full of the Spirit full. I don't know. And like, I mean, I'll walk you through it. Opening prayer, written, call to worship. Come, now is the time to worship. Pretty old one, late 90s probably. Then we did prayer of adoration. Then we did before the throne of God above, which is a 90s hymn. I think it's Stuart Townsend that wrote that in the 90s. Reformed. Hold on. And then after that was also a gospel hymn, and then corporate confession, private confession, and then like we have one antiphon, which is just like, kind of like a chant. But my wife grew up doing it. We recorded it when we were like 20 at the old Baptist church when I was first getting into learning how to do all this stuff. And we've done it before, but it's Psalm 51, creating me a clean heart, oh God. And she did that this week.
Amen.
And it reflected the liturgy because it was, and all these, like the songs reflect the liturgy because I'm doing the liturgy first. And then I'll just kind of sit and I'll think about, that points me to this. That points me to this. And then we get to a song about God's love. And what did we sing? We sang Holy, 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 which is, a great old Protestant anthem. And then, so then we do a prayer of illumination for the word, and then we do the Bible story, and then the kids go and we get the sermon ready on our projector, and then preaching. And during the preaching, I'm usually just thinking about a song. This is extemporaneous. I try to take something from the sermon.
Mhm.
And this week it was really cool because my wife nudged over and says, "How about we do How Deep the Father's Love?" Like she was thinking about, and a friend of mine told me later that he was thinking about that song, and so we do that. But we also have somebody at the end, the guy who leads the liturgy a lot. He kind of, because it's small, it's small. And I think the thing that maybe fascinates you is that how do you in a home setting create or develop or cultivate a type of chant, back read and response, a type of, how do you get people to respect that and not feel weird about that? But they had already been doing that. Like I told you that last time. And So I think it does help that there's context to that. And then at the end, we sing that song, and I do and I call it a doxology. I don't call it an invitation, and then do a benediction. And yeah, and sometimes, people have said something like, "Oh, I didn't want this to end." And I think the charismatic impulse is like, "Well, don't let it. Keep going." And then that then there's the but that there's some kind of order to, like, well, let's keep this here. Let's not try to make this everything. Let's try to make, keep that thing holy or sacred or something. Yeah. And so it's not perfect. Our kids want a youth group, and we haven't subsidized that out to another church in town yet. So it's just like, that, but there's enough of them there that there's 4 or 5 teenagers that they all went to a play on Sunday afternoon, like the high school play. So it's just, it is that evangelical line. Do you remember doing life together? Did you ever, did anyone? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, all the time. Yeah, I heard it 1,000 times potentially.
I feel like that more than anything. And there was a lady that said, we were in small group for 10 years with the same group, and we thought we were doing something. And then when COVID happened, I realized we weren't really doing anything. Part of that was stage of life where maybe they had a lot of small kids, and there's something to that where you're just showing up and, trying to manage chaos. But then another part of it is like, why is that? And I think it's because we just say, well, community is something that you put a title on when you have small group. Like, this is community. Okay, we've got community covered, everybody. Okay, so here's your community in a box. And it's just not it, So that's stuff I'm going through, man.
I can relate. I did that for 15 years. The beauty about house church is intimacy of it. And by the way, intimacy is hard. Like, it's messy, and you can't really hide issues that happen, and it's all those things. And people coming together with, I think of Acts 2:42. They met in their homes with glad and sincere hearts, right? And that was a foundational element. And so to see people seeking together, seeking Jesus together in that space, like, I know what that is, and it's beautiful, right? I think one of the things that, like, you mentioned Psalm 51 and Psalm 50 in the Orthodox stuff, but anyway, that Psalm is ever present. It's ever present in Orthodoxy, like a lot of our services. It's actually what most monastics, if they have a short prayer roll, will do the Trisagion prayer, Psalm 51, Psalm 50, and they'll do that. This week, we're doing tons of services. That Psalm is all over Holy Week, right? And so this inclination to, like, bring that in, like, that is, like, there are certain foundational things, like, there's tons of Psalms in Orthodoxy, but that Psalm is like penultimate foundational, right? Because it's the ultimate repentance, right? It's the ultimate repentance Psalm to think about there. And one of the things that I think you're trying to do, and I think Stephen Freeman talks about, we're living in this post-secular kind of, Christianity. Not that we don't believe in God, but God's this faraway thing, right? And there's we live in a 2-story universe when actually God is kind of everywhere present, filling all things, which is, I just want to encourage you for, like, liturgical, like, we have this sense, it's like, no, like, everything needs to be integrated, And so when I talked about stacking things, like, so, if you're saying liturgical prayers in your home, in your private time, and then with your family, and then with your communities getting together, your house church or whatever, but, like, that stuff scales all the way up. And so there's nothing that's sacred and isn't sacred, like our home. And that's so why do Orthodox folks have altars in their home? Part of it is like, there's no separation here, right? Like everything is integrated.
Oh, yeah.
Your life is fully integrated, right? And so the same prayers and the icons and the lighting of candles and the incense, the things you do here that you do individually and then with your family, and then you do it here. Like there's no profane. Like your home is the holy place, right?
Yeah. I
And
like that.
and yeah, so you're
The
integrating things.
It is. It's the reason I connected with Pete from Strange Theology, but first live stream he popped on, he said something. Has anybody heard of the Rabbit Room? And it's this place in Nashville that was developed by a guy named Andrew Peterson, I think he's Anglican now. I think for a while he was Presbyterian, but
Very popular worship guy.
yeah, like songwriter. And his Rabbit Room is it's a publishing house too, and they've published 2 volumes of liturgical prayers that are not historical, but they're new liturgical prayers called Every Moment Holy. And that's when you talk about God being emanating in all things and not like completely vertical, is like that's what that made me think of. And we use that, and this again, like this really does. I talk about my wife's family like all the time, but it really does come, like there's a reality to my life intersecting with my wife's life that she thinks liturgical prayers are beautiful. If I had married somebody that didn't grow up that way, she wouldn't think that. That wouldn't be a thing that's hitting me. Oh, yeah, we're 20. Hey, let's record Psalm 51 because it's really pretty. We sing it at church. Like we recorded that 20 years ago or more. And like, and when we moved houses in our town a couple years ago, we built a block and we painted on it and put everybody's name. And then we went out to the backyard and we buried it, and we all like stamped the ground together, and then we said like a liturgical thing. And then when we got to our new house, we did the same thing. We made the stones at the same time. And like I wouldn't have that if I had not married that. Then there was an understanding of beauty attached to that. And that my wife loves poetry. I'm not a big poetry guy. Sorry, girl country. That's not my thing, but it is hers.
But you're a lyricist, which is
poetry. I am. It's a weird thing. I like melody more than I like melody more than I like lyrics. I always am attracted to that first. But so yeah, that was like, there are liturgic, and we love Advent. Our family has done Advent liturgically in our home, light candles, have a little reading. That's been a huge thing. And so, and I don't know, I like the idea of like like something like that. I didn't even, as you were talking about that, I've run out of candles. I got 3 dead candles over here, but lighting a candle on this YouTube channel, it is kind of like, and having this cross, it is kind of like trying to like, where is it not, or something. So I don't know, man. Yeah. Thanks for turning the podcast.
I think one of the things I talk to people about, no, the liturgical piece to that, and you'll get this in the music piece. One of the things that was a little bit different for me is at first I was having, it was like learning scales, or if you've ever learned how to play an instrument. When you first start doing it, you're so focused on your fingers and it just feels weird. But once you continue to learn those scales, liturgical prayers, you just open yourself up to it, like it feels weird to start. But then all of a sudden, you know them and you have them. And once they become memorized, now you play music with those liturgical prayers. So now I've got these certain things that are in my heart that I can say, and I pray from my heart when I'm doing the liturgical prayer.
Mm-hmm.
And so now I'm playing music with them. So to me, liturgical prayers are like scales. And if you've ever had to learn how to play an instrument, when you very first pick it up, it is hard. And you're focused on every finger movement and note, and you do your scales and they sound bad, and then you kind of get better. But once you've learned them, you don't, like, I was a saxophone player. Once I had learned my scales and I get 3 or 4 years into it, and I was an ear guy. I wasn't very good at reading music, but once I knew how to do things, I wasn't thinking that this finger was going down for a C and this was a D flat. Like that never became like it's out of my consciousness. I was just playing,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And that's what happens with liturgical prayer. And so it can seem awkward for some. And there's also, let's just say, this Protestant bent against, let's just say, Catholicism, and there's some of that, right? So it's this push back against that, like you're like the Pharisees, and it's like, no, when they asked Jesus, hey, how to pray, he gave them a liturgical
Yeah, it is, and there's something to saying things out loud. Um, there's something to bending down on your knees, and again, other traditions, like charismatic traditions, they embody a lot of things like that, and it plays out differently, but, uh, it's like it is this weird, like and it I know that you would say, I'm gonna that you're experiencing the fullness of it. Like, this is the fullness, Um, and to a degree, I believe that. So to the point of, like, the attitude towards this, I think I mentioned this to you. No, I didn't hit on this, so I don't know if you heard this or not. When I got married at First Baptist Church, there was an archbishop and 2 nuns at my wedding. They stuck out like a Baptist church. There were comments being made,
prayer.
and me and my wife took communion, but we took it on a Catholic kneeler. That was my grandma. My wife's grandma's.
Mhm.
And so, man, I'm just telling you, I'm a weird dude. Like,
Yeah, God has primed you in a lot of different arenas,
it's
and he,
weird.
everything that he's done and all your experiences, he will use for himself, right, in his glory, and
Yeah.
so on and so forth. And so, I think that's amazing. One of the things that I found, and this is the most powerful thing I can say that I didn't realize, but I talked to you about, I played these scales and I had these liturgical prayers in my heart, and most particularly the Jesus prayer.
Yes.
Previously, how I would pray, and I found this rhythm that worked for me, is I would first listen to some worship music, then I would read scripture, right? And I'd prime in my pump, and then I would do Bill Hybels' Acts prayer, adoration,
Mm.
confession, thanksgiving, supplication, which was based on the Our Father. But it's like, well, Jesus didn't want it. I'm being, because guys, I'm making a joke. He doesn't want us to pray the Our Father, but he wants, here's how he gave us. This is how you do this extemporaneously. It's like, okay, whatever. But anyway, that's what I did. That was my disciple thing. And then I would sit, after doing that, I would sit quietly and allow these impressions to listen to God, right? And I found this thing where God would give me like 2 or 3 things I needed to do in a day, right? And it might be like, go up and tell your wife you love her, and I don't know, like it would be this repetitive thing. I'm like, well, I don't know that. And like, maybe she needed to really hear that in a moment. Or it'd be like, call this friend. And sometimes it'd be this wild thing where that friend was asking for a sign and God called it. It might even be, for someone like me, pay the electric bill. And the reason is I hadn't paid the electric bill, even though I had money in the bank, and I'm worried about not paying the electric bill. He's like giving me little, I'm telling you, it's minutia. But here is the problem with that: the spirit is willing and the flesh is weak. When you don't have the words to pray, and you have to get yourself into extemporaneous prayer, you will not pray because you do not have the words. That was my problem. And one of the things I've shared for me, which is I went through finding a surprising death of a kind of an extended family member that I had been talking to over the years about trying to get them into recovery. And they just couldn't quite get it. And I was just hopeful. And I know why they called me. Like, I knew when I got the call, they were seeking something I had, but they just couldn't find their way into the 12-step program. But they had been in and out of treatment, had lost their marriage. Like, everything was just a mess. But I thought they'd finally got it. And then I got a call that they had fallen down the stairs. And I knew it. And I knew immediately that meant falling down the stairs drunk and died, broke their neck. And my wind was taken out of my sails. And this happens every now and again in your life. I've had a wife who passed away. Like, there's these moments that like just hits you. And immediately I had that rush of the air feels heavy, sick feeling in your stomach, mind racing. Like, we've all had those moments where things are happening. And then I sat down and I immediately had my prayer robe right next to my bed. And I started praying the Jesus prayer for him and for his family. And I do it over and over. Lord Jesus Christ, bless and have mercy on, let's just say Bob. Lord Jesus Christ, bless and have mercy on Bob. Lord Jesus Christ, bless and have mercy on. And I started saying his family names. And I did that for about 5 or 10 minutes. And what happened is all that stuff that people who felt that moment, like it brought in me a peace that I could have never obtained on my own. And I didn't have the words to pray. You know what I'm talking about? Like you're in that moment. And I had this practice that I could lean on and immediately get my heart in prayer for them. But it also gave me a sense that when I was done doing that, I had some grounding. And that was to me when I realized, whoa, this liturgical prayer has a depth and a practicality that I can rely on when you get hit and you're knocked off your feet, where extemporaneous prayer never. And I'm again trying to do this with all my heart, mind, body, and soul. So I'm very passionate about bringing liturgical prayer out to people because I believe it's the thing that you can do when you don't have the words to pray, and when crisis hits. If you've developed that practice and practiced your scales, when the moment hits, you'll be able to play the music that will calm your soul.
I love that. Man. Well, let's leave it on that today. How's that sound, Lance?
Sounds good, brother. Thanks for being patient with me and the internet.
Yeah, it was definitely choppy, but we made it. And I hope like that this kind of, this just continues to keep the ball and the conversation going about this interesting thing that's taking place. So thanks for showing up with me today, Lance. All right, man.
Love you what you're doing here, Christian.
All right, we'll end it backstage. Here we go. Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud.